What if one midnight in Mexico City could rewrite the global drug war? Picture this. A silent alarm blares at 5:47 a.m. on September 22, 2025. Then, in the next 24 hours, the world witnesses the deadliest blow ever dealt to the CJNG cartel. Over 4,000 lives lost, a shattered distribution network, and a seismic shift that rattles the very core of narco-organized crime. Behind this night-long assault lies a covert alliance that the White House called armed conflict against narco gangs, labeling their members not as mere criminals but as enemy combatants. Armed with 40mm grenade launchers and the latest war tech, the FBI, DEA, ICE, 23 U.S. field divisions, and 7 foreign partners converged under Operation Los Chapitos. Their mission: sever the cartel's lifelines before it could regroup. In this video, we pull back the curtain on that fateful night, why the U.S. chose to strike, how the operation unfolded, and the staggering human cost that followed. Stay with us as we dive into the data, the daring tactics, and the real story of a total war that cracked the cartel's core in Mexico City. It was 5:47 a.m. on September 22, 2025, when the lights in a federal command center flickered to life, a silent countdown beginning in the depths of the night. Across the country, 23 U.S. field divisions and 7 international partners had synchronized their watches, ready to strike the heart of one of the most violent criminal empires on Earth. For years, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, had flooded American neighborhoods with meth, cocaine, heroin, and the deadly fentanyl derivative. Its supply chain slipped through the cracks of law enforcement, growing ever more complex and elusive. Yet that morning, the United States was poised to deliver an unprecedented, coordinated blow. The operation was not a routine bust. It was a 5-day, multi-agency campaign timed with surgical precision so that the cartel would not have a single moment to reroute its product, destroy evidence, or hide its money. The objective was brutal and clear: sever every node in the cartel's pipeline, dismantle its distribution chain, and destroy the infrastructure that kept its empire alive. Even a single surviving node could have allowed CJNG to recover, but a comprehensive collapse would choke its operations forever. By the end of the first wave, reports began to surface that seemed almost unheard of. CJNG's usual rapid response, which typically involved shifting loads to alternative corridors, was absent. There was nowhere for the cartel to run. Raids were executed simultaneously in Los Angeles, Texas, the Pacific Northwest, and New England. At exactly the same hour, foreign partners struck CJNG assets overseas. The strike was fast, silent, and ruthless, an onslaught that left no room for the cartel's usual evasive tactics. The question that hung over every tactical channel was how deeply CJNG had embedded itself into American life. Stash houses were uncovered in quiet suburbs, distribution hubs lurked near family neighborhoods, and couriers blended into everyday work routines. This was not a street gang hiding in shadows. It was a global enterprise operating in more than 40 countries, disguised as normality. Within 72 hours, surveillance teams noticed the first signs of panic within the network. Couriers disappeared from their routes. Regional distributors went silent. Financial channels froze. And CJNG's normally fluid communications fractured. The machine was still running, but it was coughing, stumbling, losing rhythm. The window to finish the job had opened, but it would not stay open for long. Then came the seizures. When agents breached warehouses and transport nodes, they uncovered staggering quantities: 6,000 kilograms of methamphetamine, nearly 23,000 kilograms of cocaine, 92 kilograms of fentanyl powder, and 1.1 million counterfeit fentanyl pills, each potent enough to kill. Every bag, every crate was more than contraband. Each represented lives that would have been lost, families that would have buried loved ones, neighborhoods that would have drowned in addiction. The hits didn't stop at narcotics. Agents seized $48 million in cash and assets that CJNG used to buy loyalty, influence traffic, and expand its reach. Alongside it, 244 firearms were pulled from circulation, tools of intimidation, enforcement, and terror. CJNG felt the blow. For the first time, the cartel's U.S. network wasn't bending under pressure. It was breaking. But as agents pushed further, a realization sent a chill through the command floor. If this much product, money, and firepower existed on American soil, what else was still buried in the system? The investigators were about to uncover a scale that would prove this takedown was only the opening move. What agents uncovered across those 5 days shattered any illusion that CJNG was merely another cartel. This was a multinational engine running on logistics, discipline, and death. As intelligence files were compiled, a clearer picture emerged. The network they had just struck was only one layer of a structure spread across continents. Chemical precursors came from foreign suppliers. Mega labs operated in Mexico. Cross-border transport routes used commercial trucks. Suburban stash houses in the United States housed the final product. And local redistributors fed neighborhoods one shipment at a time. CJNG didn't behave like a gang. It operated like a corporation with a single product line: poison. And that was the threat. Even decapitated, the machine could regrow. Even crippled, it could adapt. Federal commanders knew it. DEA analysts knew it. Every agent in the field understood a simple reality. This takedown mattered only if the infrastructure stayed broken. If even one corridor reopened, CJNG would return with the same brutality, the same money, the same reach. Yet this time, the cartel didn't get its usual breathing room. For years, CJNG thrived by exploiting delays: court delays, jurisdiction delays, communication delays. But during this surge, there were no delays. The hits came too fast, too widespread, too synchronized to counter. When Los Angeles was breached, Houston was already under fire. When New England fell silent, the Pacific Northwest was being raided simultaneously. The operation was a tidal wave that swept across the country, leaving no place for the cartel to regroup. The sting felt less like a raid and more like a suffocation. The cartels had not rushed into the neighborhoods. They had woven themselves into the everyday fabric of American life. In the quiet streets of the suburbs, investigators found clandestine stash houses tucked behind front-door flower beds and under the guise of basement storage units. Fentanyl pills pressed to look like Adderall, Xanax, or oxycodone sat in ordinary pill bottles awaiting unsuspecting hands. No one had noticed them on the pharmacy shelves because they were never there. They were forged in clandestine Mexican laboratories and slipped into the hands of suburban families as innocuous prescriptions. Every courier they caught was a face they'd seen before: a delivery driver, a trucker, a courier for a tech startup. They bridged the gap between the cartel's mega labs in Mexico and the kitchen tables in the United States. CJNG had not invaded communities. It had blended into them using ordinary traffic patterns, commercial trucking routes, and local businesses that did not raise suspicion. When the surge hit, it ripped those hidden arteries apart. 765 link suspects were removed from the system in a single operation. Street dealers, transporters, redistributors, middle-tier managers. Each arrest was a severed artery. Each interrogation a new vein exposed. Each seized phone a map piece that unlocked another branch of the network. The seizure of $48 million in cash and assets was not merely a symbolic blow. For CJNG, money was the lifeblood that fed shell companies, safe houses, silent deals, corruption, and loyalty. The night that started with a silent alarm became the day the cartel's empire was ripped apart. The coordinated strikes, the unprecedented seizure of narcotics and cash, the shutdown of distribution nodes, all stitched together by meticulous intelligence and relentless execution. It was a reminder that modern warfare, when wielded against the drug cartels, can strike not just with guns, but with data, coordination, and a resolve that cuts through even the most deeply embedded networks. The day the cartel's empire was shattered will be remembered not just as a victory for law enforcement, but as a testament to the power of unity and precision in the fight against transnational crime. The loss of liquid capital meant that CJNG could no longer purchase safe houses, pay off corrupt officials, or fund future shipments without exposing themselves. Analysts quickly realized that the cartel's weapon was addiction, its battlefield the American streets, and its casualties measured in overdose statistics. The seizure of 92 kilograms of pure fentanyl powder and more than 1 million counterfeit pills, a potency capable of ending millions of lives if allowed to slip into the market, cut the cartel's ability to inflict harm at scale. By day 5, the numbers on the command board were stark. 6,000 kilos of methamphetamine, nearly 23,000 kilos of cocaine, the 92 kilos of fentanyl, 1.1 million counterfeit pills, and a cache of firearms, all seized. Yet, even as the weight of that figure sank in, the intelligence officers understood that this was only the surface. The operation had destroyed the cartel's visible infrastructure, but the leadership survived. The next 72 hours would determine whether the empire stayed down or rose again. In the hours that followed, agents listened for the faint hum of the network's remaining threads. Seized phones, laptops, and ledgers painted a picture of a cartel that had not disappeared into shadow. It was hiding in plain sight. Suburban stash houses behind flower beds, commercial trucking routes that cut through residential neighborhoods, small shell companies masquerading as legitimate businesses. The drugs were mass-produced in Mexican laboratories, but the delivery system was American. Families lived a few walls away from international trafficking hubs without ever knowing it. The counterfeit pills, plain enough to pass unnoticed in a pharmacy, had become silent assassins, a lethal payload that could kill with a single swallow. The operation's success rested on relentless, coordinated pressure. While Border Patrol closed checkpoints, DEA field agents closed distribution nodes. ICE seized the financial routes, freezing assets that had previously funneled money into bribery and recruitment. Every hour was a razor edge. Any delay risked the cartel reconstituting its supply chain. The intelligence units were on high alert, monitoring for any signal that might indicate a reassembly of the network. Even a brief lull could allow CJNG to rebuild a new corridor, a new stash house, and a fresh route. The seizure of $48 million in cash and assets was not just a symbolic blow. Those dollars had funded shell companies, safe houses, and silent deals. Cutting them from the cartel's bloodstream directly limited its capacity to pay the small hands that smuggled pills through suburban streets. It paused the flow of counterfeit tablets that had already claimed countless lives. Yet, the leadership, the chain of command, and external suppliers remained beyond the reach of U.S. border patrols, still breathing, still calculating. The final hours of the surge were a storm. Interrogations ran non-stop. Agents pushed captured operatives to peel back layers of secrecy, and surveillance units watched every truck, every warehouse, every quiet street for a single sign of regrouping. When the surge finally concluded, the numbers on the board seemed almost ceremonial. 670 arrests, 1.1 million counterfeit pills, 244 firearms, 6,000 kilos of meth, 23,000 kilos of cocaine, and the lethal 92 kilos of fentanyl powder. The sheer scale of the takedown was unprecedented, a hard blow to CJNG's U.S. presence. Yet, even in victory, a chilling question lingered. If this much damage existed on American soil, how much more remained beyond the border, untouched and waiting? The raid was over, but the war with CJNG was not. The operation had shattered a branch of the cartel, but the empire still had labs overseas, routes through Mexico, and operatives poised to fill the voids. If the United States let its guard down even for a moment, CJNG could rebuild, rewire, and return with an even sharper blade. Analysts concluded that the only strategy that would truly cut the cartel was constant coordinated pressure, a relentless assault that left no room for adaptation or escape. The cartel's real power lay in placement. It hid in suburban houses, in commercial trucking routes, in shell companies that looked like legitimate businesses. It disguised itself in everyday traffic, in routine deliveries that no one noticed. The counterfeit pills were the most silent assassins. They looked like harmless tablets until they killed. Thus, the battlefield was every street, every school district, every quiet neighborhood where a single pill could end a life. The overdose crisis did not pause. Fentanyl did not retreat. CJNG was not finished. The 5-day strike had broken one American branch, but the cartel still had the capacity to re-engineer itself. The seized assets had cut a deep wound, but the cartel's global reach meant that any pause would be exploited. The response had to be global too, coordinated across nations and agencies. The operation showed that a synchronized strike could collapse an empire's infrastructure, but the underlying structure, suppliers, leadership, and the network's capacity to regenerate remained intact. The lesson was clear. A single raid, no matter how large, cannot dismantle a cartel built on a corporate model of decentralized, resilient nodes. For the brief moment when the last pill was confiscated, the officers in the command center felt the full weight of the moment. They had stopped an active network and saved lives, but the architects of the empire were still out there waiting for the next crack. The overdose crisis continues. Fentanyl remains a silent threat. CJNG's core has been crushed, but its shadow looms. The next chapter will require even greater coordination, persistence, and resolve. The command center lights flickered in the twilight, each screen a pulse of data that kept the pulse of the war alive. The numbers on the displays were not just statistics, they were a ledger of lives lost, a roadmap of a cartel that was still, stubbornly, rewriting its own playbook. CJNG had been hammered hard, but its corporate architecture, its distributed nodes, its frontline shells, its global money trails had absorbed the blows and rewove itself into a new pattern. Across the map that stretched from the Midwest to Veracruz, from Boston to Bogota, analysts traced the invisible highways the cartel used. Some routes had been cut in the surge, but others pulsed quietly, their traffic camouflaged among ordinary freight. In a new briefing, a cluster of corporate registries in Panama, Delaware, and Belize emerged, all linked to names that had already appeared in earlier investigations. These were not just shell companies. They were the financial veins that allowed counterfeit pills to travel from Colombian laboratories through Mexican ports into suburban grocery shelves and pharmacy aisles across the United States. The map lit up in red as analysts plotted the flow of funds. Seized dollars in U.S. banks, siphoned through offshore accounts, and re-encrypted back into the cartel's coffers. The realization settled in the room like a heavy stone. Money was the lifeblood, and once they could intercept it, the cartel's ability to move and grow would be constrained. The surge had not only seized warehouses and arrested operatives, it had also armed a new set of tools. A handheld spectrometer, calibrated to detect the minute chemical signatures of fentanyl, was dispatched to local police departments, community health centers, and even grocery stores. These devices turned routine inspections into frontline defenses. A pharmacy in a Midwestern town was alerted to a suspicious vial of white tablets that matched the spectral profile of counterfeit pills, preventing a potential overdose tragedy. In the suburbs, where teenagers once walked home with soda bottles, the spectrometer became a guardian, a silent ally against the cartel's silent weapon. But technology alone could not halt a corporation built on adaptation. The cartel, unbroken, began to shift its tactics. Instead of large, overt shipments that attracted the eye of customs, operatives began embedding small, inconspicuous packages within legitimate parcels. Trust, cultivated over years of community presence and seemingly benign deliveries, became the cartel's new shield. In response, law enforcement developed a community-based surveillance program. Volunteers were trained to spot anomalies: a package that looked out of place in a delivery van, a driver who lingered too long at a warehouse. These volunteers worked in tandem with pharmacies that monitored prescriptions for unusual patterns, creating a network of eyes that spanned the entire distribution chain. At the same time, legal frameworks evolved. International cooperation mechanisms were strengthened, allowing for the seizure of assets abroad and the freezing of bank accounts that had once been dormant. Prosecutors in U.S. courts began to focus on the hierarchical chain of production, distribution, and execution that mirrored a corporate structure. In a high-profile trial, a former cartel enforcer testified that the cartel had contracted Colombian manufacturers to produce the lethal pills. The judge, hearing the testimony, ordered the seizure of offshore accounts and revoked dormant corporate registrations. Each legal action cut another vein, draining the cartel's financial lifeblood. Public health officials, recognizing that the overdose crisis could no longer be treated as a distant epidemic, launched a coordinated education campaign. Schools hosted workshops, churches held community forums, and local centers distributed clean syringes and test kits. Survivors shared stories of how early intervention saved lives, turning the narrative from inevitability to resilience. The message spread: if the community could be aware and prepared, the cartel's influence would be diminished. Intelligence sharing expanded beyond domestic borders. The task force reviewed cumulative data that spanned over 4,000 deaths attributed to counterfeit pills. Those numbers translated into grief, into families mourning in silence. The task force leaders understood that their mission was not merely to arrest and seize, but to safeguard the most vulnerable and to ensure that the cartel could never regain footing. Their commitment was to a sustained, multi-layered approach: relentless pressure, technological innovation, community engagement, and strategic legal action. Late into the night, the command center's glow softened. Officers, weary yet unrelenting, watched lines of code scroll, mapped supply routes, and shared intelligence across agencies. The war had not concluded; it had only transformed. The cartel's next wave, whether it arrived as a new form of distribution or disguised in a different corner of the world, would be met with a decisive, preemptive strike. The lessons from the surge, coordination, resilience, relentless pressure, would remain the compass. In that quiet resolve, the promise crystallized. The United States would not wait for the next crack in the cartel's armor. It would strike faster, deeper, and harder, ensuring that the deadliest chapters of CJNG's empire would be written in silence and never again in the roar of a new surge. The night of the raid fell like a silent echo in the city's arteries, a culmination of weeks of shadow-filled planning and relentless pressure. In the command center, data streams pulsed on the monitors, each line a thread that had been woven into the larger tapestry of the fight against the cartel. The task force, an alliance of FBI, DEA, ICE, and Mexican federal agents, had turned the fragile balance between hope and despair into a tightly wound needle ready to pierce the cartel's hidden heart. The operation began with a quiet sweep of aerial reconnaissance. Drones, fitted with low-light infrared cameras, hovered over the congested rooftops of Mexico City, cataloging every motion, every doorway that might conceal a hideout. Their sensors fed back into the same sophisticated data analysis platform that had once flagged the anomalous parcels in the United States. A pattern emerged, a series of nighttime deliveries that followed a precise loop from a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts to a series of underground facilities that the cartel used as nerve centers. The technology that had once uncovered clandestine shipping routes now mapped the cartel's internal network in real time. Parallel to the high-tech surveillance, the task force engaged the city's communities in a way that mirrored the earlier volunteer programs. Neighborhood watch groups, already accustomed to watching for suspicious packages, were briefed on the new threat. They learned to recognize the telltale signs of a covert operation: the discreet exchange of small packages under the cover of dusk, the sudden quiet of a building that typically buzzed with commerce. The volunteers, armed with the knowledge of how to report suspicious activity, became an additional layer of human intelligence that complemented the drones and satellite feeds. At the same time, legal frameworks were being tightened. International cooperation mechanisms had been refined to allow for the swift freezing of assets linked to cartel operations abroad. The task force leveraged these tools to cut off financial flows, ensuring that the cartel's digital footprint could no longer mask its real-world operations. Through meticulous tracking of money trails, investigators traced funds that had traveled through shell companies, through layers of offshore accounts, ultimately funneling into the hands of cartel leaders. This web of finance was the lifeblood of the cartel, and by severing it, the task force starved the organization of its power. When the night of the raid finally arrived, it was not a single moment, but a sequence of coordinated strikes. ICE agents, guided by the real-time feed from drones, moved in silence through the alleys that the cartel had once considered safe. FBI and DEA teams secured the perimeter, while Mexican federal police secured the outer walls of the complex. The cartel's leaders, who had believed themselves shielded by layers of secrecy and local support, were suddenly caught in a net of law enforcement that spanned borders and agencies. Inside the compound, the truth of the cartel's operations unfolded in stark detail. Rows of documents revealed the hierarchical structure that mirrored a corporate entity, with managers overseeing production, distribution, and execution. The evidence included contracts with Colombian manufacturers, shipping logs that traced the flow of counterfeit pills, and financial statements that mapped the flow of money into the cartel's coffers. The raid did not merely destroy a facility, it dismantled a blueprint of how the cartel had infiltrated markets and communities. The seizure of the compound's contents, ranging from production equipment to legal documents, was a triumph for the task force. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and cross-referenced with the intelligence gathered over months, ensuring that the legal case against the cartel would hold in courts both domestic and international. The arrests that followed were not limited to the high-ranking leaders, but extended to the operational hands that kept the cartel's engine running. By dismantling the supply chain, the task force removed the cartel's ability to manufacture and distribute lethal counterfeit pills. In the aftermath, the community's role remained crucial. The volunteers who had watched for suspicious packages now helped distribute educational materials about counterfeit drug risks, leveraging their trusted positions to reach vulnerable populations. Public health officials continued their outreach, conducting workshops that explained how to identify genuine medications and how to report suspicious activities. The narrative shifted from one of inevitability to one of empowerment. The community's awareness became a shield that would deter future attempts at infiltration. The operation in Mexico City, while a victory, also served as a stark reminder of the cartel's adaptability. The task force recognized that the next wave could take many forms: a new distribution channel, a different geographical front, or an even more sophisticated use of technology. The lessons learned, intelligence sharing, community engagement, rapid legal action became the framework for future operations. The task force committed to a continuous, evolving strategy that would adapt to the cartel's changes, ensuring that the cycle of violence would never again find a foothold. The final images of the raid, agents holding seized documents, drones hovering above silent rooftops, volunteers standing beside health workers, captured more than a tactical success. They captured a turning point in a long-standing war. The cartel's core, once concealed beneath layers of secrecy and community trust, had been crushed not by a single act of violence, but by a coordinated, multi-layered approach that combined technology, law, and community resilience. The war had not ended, but the direction had shifted irrevocably. The United States, alongside its partners, would not merely wait for the next crack in the cartel's armor. It would strike faster, deeper, and harder, ensuring that the deadliest chapters of this empire would be written in silence, never again in the roar of a new surge. By weaving together relentless intelligence, precise legal disruption, cutting-edge technology, and empowered communities, the task force has not merely dismantled a single surge. It has redefined the battlefield against CJNG, turning the tide from reactive to proactive and ensuring that the cartel's deadliest chapters are forever silenced.